Welcome to the 25th Headwaters Conference. How's everyone doing tonight? All right. It's wonderful to see 500 friendly faces here in Gunnison, even though there's beer and cheese right now in Crested Butte. It's very bold of you. There's a lot to be grateful this year in this 25th anniversary, and there are a lot of exciting things to share and announce. And I think the first among all of them that I think you all be very appreciative of is that we're now the Bud Light Up for Whatever Headwaters Conference. They called me this morning. They offered me $1 million endowment if Art dyes his beard Bud Light blue. So look for that next year. I want to thank our opening poet and musician. Art Goodtimes was our opening poet. Let's hear it for Art. Thank you, Art. Art has done it all. Art's a poet, deep ecologist, and rainbow family elder. Art Goodtimes of Norwood, Colorado. He weaves non-traditional coil baskets. He grows over 25 varieties of organic heirloom potatoes, and he's serving his 5th term in Telluride as Colorado's only Green Party County Commissioner. He is the founder of various Talking Gourds poetry events since 1989. He's the poet in residence of the Telluride Mushroom Festival since 1981. Art, can I reveal your email address? shroompaw@gmail.com. I see the phones coming out right now. He served as the first poet laureate of the Western Slope, and his most recent book is Looking South to Lone Cone, the Cloud Acre Poems. And so let's thank Art again. Thanks, Art. And then Alan, our musician, Alan Wartz is a local writer, poet, musician, filmmaker, philosopher, and homesteader. He's recently returned to the Gunnison Valley. He graduated from Western the same year I did, 96. And like me, he's back for good. And after 10 years living on the Front Range, and he and his wife Issa are very glad to be home. Let's welcome Alan home. All right, Alan. We do have some new things this year that make this year particularly exciting. In addition to our keynote speaker, Gary Snyder, we have our new Master's Environmental Management program. 35 graduate students from 30 different universities and many different environmental organizations are now part of our community. Let's welcome them. Yeah. And 8 new faculty have joined the Center for Environment and Sustainability faculty that also houses the Headwaters Conference. And so they've now joined our community. And we also have with us this year the Center for Humans and Nature out of Chicago. They're special friends of the Headwaters Conference, and they've brought the Urban Wild panel from as far as San Francisco, Cincinnati, and Chicago to sort of challenge how we think about the human production of wildness here in the Rockies. So let's welcome the Center for Humans and Nature. Thank you for being here. Aaron Abeyta is one of the Headwaters elders. He's from Antonito, Colorado, mayor now of Antonito. Mayor Aaron Abeyta. He is an American Book Award-winning poet for his book Culture, and he also is the high school football coach in Antonito. He's just published a new book based on his letters that he writes to this conference every year called Letters from the Headwaters. And so Aaron will be reading at 3 o'clock tomorrow in the University Center. Please catch that. He's a brilliant poet. He was a nominee for Colorado Poet Laureate this year. And so his books are out in the hallway after the reading. Gary Snyder's generously offered to sign books, as has Aaron Abeyta. So please take advantage of that. And of course, I need to thank the founders of this now 25th anniversary, 24-year-old conference, Devon Pena, Laurie McCall, George Sibley, Art Goodtimes. Let's just thank them for creating this conversation that goes on. So, yes. This year's topic is an interesting one. This is the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. Okay, it's also the 90th anniversary of the first wilderness area. It's also the 100th anniversary of John Muir's death. And so it's an important year to be thinking about wilderness. And wilderness has become a very interesting topic, I think, in our public consciousness. On one hand, it's a very mundane term. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of a bill that went through Congress. It was voted on positively after 9 years of debate by every House member except one, right? And so, and it happens to be zoning on public lands, a different way of using public lands so that motorized vehicles and industrial activity can't occur in certain areas. So when you think of it from that perspective, pretty basic, right? Just a form of zoning that got a pretty good vote in the House. But it's also something massive, right? When you look at the legislation itself, and you look at phrasing in there like places where man is a visitor who does not remain, you realize that this is really a social rethinking of the human place in the universe. And it's a very humbling way of thinking about our place in the universe. And so this year we're celebrating that sort of humility in the face of infinitely expanding complexity of the world that created us. And that's what the Wilderness Act, at the end of the day, is really about, beyond whether or not you can ride your mountain bike in a certain wilderness area. It really gets at what is the world, who are we, how are we to live in a new way. But what we wanted to do this year is we did not want to do sort of a classic retrospective on 50 years of wilderness. In fact, we chose to shift away from public lands-based wilderness areas. Instead, think about the working wild. And that is what kind of human work produces and co-creates wildness. Right? The roots of the word wilderness go way back in Old English to meaning self-willed land or willfulness. Right? And so when we think about self-willed land, that's not just the West Elk or Fossil Ridge wilderness areas, right? A ranch is self-willed land. A ranch is self-willed land run by a self-willed being that evolved in the same world as that self-willed land, right? And so what does it mean to merge our self-willed species and our self-willed communities with self-willed land? We're going to look at the private wild tomorrow and hear from ranchers who've worked on that. We're going to hear about in urban settings, right? What does it mean in some of our major cities like even Chicago, right? For self-willed communities, sometimes in the south side of Chicago, struggling to find their agency, and what kind of wildness gets created in that setting. We're going to look at the common wild, and Dr. Devon Pena has been very generous in bringing together a retrospective panel almost 20 years after a protest of Acequia Hispanos farmers and mostly white ancient forest rescue protesters who protested together to protect the wild with very different views of the wild. And what does it mean to merge those views of the wild? And how does that kind of effort to preserve that kind of human community produce the wild? Our guest tonight, Gary Snyder, will remind us, if you read his essays in Practice of the Wild, he'll remind us we'd be very careful with these words that I'm throwing around right now: wilderness, wildness, nature. And he's going to, tonight, share with us a criteria for phrases even like the working wild. And I think that's a perfect way to start the conference. Many of you are familiar with Gary Snyder. Some of you who may be starting college have not heard of him, and you're going to learn a lot about him tonight, mostly from him. Some of you might think of Gary as a Beat Generation poet who was at the 6 Galleries readings in San Francisco that sort of launched that movement in literary America up on stage with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Some of you might be Kerouac fans, and you know that to some extent Gary inspired his character in the Dharma Bums, Chaffee Ryder. Some of you might know of him because of his Pulitzer Prize-winning book of poems, Turtle Island. And some of you might know of him for him as an inspiration of anything from Zen Buddhism to deep ecology to off-the-grid building in America. But it's his ideas on wilderness and wildness from his 1990 book, The Practice of the Wild, that is the inspiration for this weekend's topic. He asked us, like I said, to be very careful with these words. We were having lunch yesterday at the Firebrand, and over an Epicurean sandwich, Gary looked across the table, and I wrote it on my hand, and then I washed my hands. I was like, what does it say? I'm trying to remember everything that comes out of his mouth while he's visiting. And I want you to think on this. He said, we should not ask, how pristine is a wilderness? Instead, we should ask, what is the proportion of wild process in everything, including ourselves? We should not ask how pristine is a wilderness. We should ask, what is the proportion of wild process? It's pretty heavy, right? It is heavy. It's a heavy thought. But luckily, I think maybe Gary's most important gift to eternity is something else he shared with us, which is just simply stay together, learn the flowers, go light. Let's welcome Gary.
I didn't know John was such a good public figure. My gosh. You can never judge people by their name. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm very glad to be here. I've been back and forth across parts of Colorado, one time and another, over the last 50 or 60 years. Never been here before. So I'm looking around saying, as I came in yesterday from Fort Collins, I wonder what was here 10,000 years ago. Looks like it might have been a good place for pronghorns. Maybe some bison? And it turns out I wasn't too far off. Yesterday afternoon, we went up to the, drove up, some of us, to the top of the W Mountain to look at some Folsom era, 10,500-year-old diggings of possible artifacts and living sites out there on that huge, broad flat and under your huge, great, beautiful sky. And so this is like a wonderfully opening, instructive new environment for me to be in. I'm going to do two things tonight. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, maybe 15 or 20, in prose, about some of the definitions and ideas that go with wild and nature and wilderness, and the thinking and politics that go with that in these days, which are becoming rather contentious right now. And the questions of public land, public space, and the agencies that manage it, and the agencies that sometimes seem to not even realize that the land that their managing belongs to the people and not to the federal government. So here we'll go with some of this. But first of all, I simply want to remind us all, whatever I say, we say, or anybody else says, and whatever is happening, there is plenty of occasion to be grateful for this amazing planet and this amazing universe we're on. And it will never be ruined. It can swallow pollution like Shiva drank the poison out of the ocean, which turned him blue, but he was okay afterwards. So whatever else we're in a great, amazing place for which we have respect and gratitude. And then I'll go on and be critical about some things. Speaking of which, that reminds me, because I just heard about how, who was it, Budweiser? Painted some streets blue in Crested Butte. The Puranas, the great cosmological mythologies of India, which tell the stories of Shiva and Vishnu, they describe a time span of hundreds and thousands of millions of years that all of this has been going on, and through which all of us, in one way or another, or in one form or another, have been passing through. And they say, every few 100 million years, some of the negative forces, the demonic forces that hang out, trying to figure out things to do, will try to destroy the world and try to destroy animals and people and everything. We have to deal with that from time to time. So on one occasion, the big, gigantic, funny, demonic forces were churning up the ocean and putting into it the poison that would kill everything. And it was the young, handsome Shiva who had a beautiful young wife named Parvati and a really sweet white cow, bull, a Brahma bull that was his friend, and a snake that lived around his neck. And he said, oh, gosh, somebody's got to eat that shit. I guess I'll do it. And that's why he's blue. And he is still blue. You'll see most of the iconography of Shiva that you would see in India or in a book. His color is blue. He's still recovering, but slowly, and it doesn't bother him. Just a few words about vocabulary that I've been struggling with. The word wild, the word nature, the word wilderness. In my way of thinking about these things, I concluded that we need to use the wild as precisely as possible, remembering that it does mean sometimes crazy, promiscuous, uncontrolled behavior. I understand that. But its main meaning is orderly, sensible, and self-managing. Isn't that interesting? If you ask what is a wild animal, it's an animal that is taking care of itself. What is a wild plant? It's a plant that does not require that you water or fertilize it. It's just growing away, doing its thing. The whole wild world and the whole meaning of the wild world is a meaning of self-organizing, self-maintaining, in a sense, self-disciplining, which is the equivalent of the Chinese word for the wild, which is zhiran, which means self-managing. It's a different and interesting way to think of what wild might mean. And in scientific and technical terms, I guess that is what it does mean. Although, you know, I've had my book which is called The Practice of the Wild, translated now into 6 or 7 languages. And there are several languages, like the Czech language, for example, that have had a terrible time finding a way to find a word for wild in their own language that somehow approximated the wonderful subtlety of the way the English works. And the English works that way only because we made it work that way. Its origins, which are Germanic, go back to the word Wald, which is forest, forested. You know, like Thoreau's Walden, that means a woodsy place. I don't know if he knew that or not. He probably did. He knew almost everything else. Then the word nature, how would one handle that? Well, you can take it to mean the outdoors, the green, the natural world, and so forth. But in the sciences, the nature goes back all the way to the old Greek word physis, from which physics comes. And it means simply the entire of physical universe, including the scientific physical laws by which it operates. And so everything is physical, everything is under phenomena, including the wild, and you have to distinguish the wild then by saying, well, that is the product of human agency. So wild nature is nature as altered or shaped or directed by human agency, and the rest of the universe is just nature. What about the supernatural? Some people say, oh, it's just another part of nature. And some people say, leave that to somebody else. At any rate, I'm not going to deal with it now. So then what does that make wilderness? Because the words wild and wilderness are really confused a lot. You know, what did Thoreau, when they quote Thoreau, they say, what do they say? They don't say, in wilderness is the preservation of the world. Thoreau says, in wildness is the preservation of the world. And that is a considerable difference, because where do you find the wild in the world? You find it in vacant lots in cities. You find it along the edges of the marsh and in the marsh. You find it along the edges of polluted canals. You find it in your own imagination. You find it in your breathing and in your own digestion. A great part of what our own bodies do for us is, fortunately, wild. We do not have to stop and think to ourselves, I need to breathe 3 times every minute or something, and make a little order go out for that. Nor do we have to say to ourselves, I have now eaten food, so I instruct my stomach to start digesting. We're very fortunate, to still be virtually wild creatures. Believe it or not. David Brower, and to his memory, wonderful man, once said at a public gathering, he said, some people think that the human species is a domesticated species, that we are no longer what we were. He says, and they have to be wrong. But how do you domesticate things? How do you get some dogs to chase ducks and other dogs to run around behind sheep, and some dogs to bark at coyotes and other dogs to just snuggle up with you? It's all genetic manipulation. He says, and we do that by selecting and choosing which male to breed to which female, managed husbandry of the breeding. He says, human beings have always reproduced chaotically. Nobody is in charge of who makes out with who, ultimately. So we must be still wild. Isn't that an interesting way to approach it? I'll go for that. And also, it's not important or necessary to get caught up in the dialogue or the argument that is going on right now in some conservation circles about whether or not our established wilderness areas are pristine or not pristine, or how long has there been human impact to one degree or another on some part of the physical universe. I have, without ever having gotten involved in the issue even, all the way back to my early youth, which was that of a backcountry animist, I always figured that nothing was quite pristine and it didn't matter. And I think that would be true of, it is no argument against wilderness to say, oh yeah, human beings have been around here for 15,000 years, so it can't be wild anymore. Come on. It's a measure of how much of, and this is why what John was quoting of me, it's the percentage of wild process that counts. And a wilderness is a place where the overwhelming percentage of wild process is wild process. And the percentage that you might guess to have been part of the impact of sheep herders in the 1860s is very tiny. Or in some places it might be a little bit larger, like in the southern Sierra Nevada high meadows, where the sheep did hammer it a bit, but it'll recover. And it is recovering, since those times. Plus, do not expect recovery to happen in 20 years, or 40 years, or 100 years, or 500 years, or 1,000 years. We got lots of time. Nature takes its time. And I was looking at the hydraulic mining diggings, which are between my house and the actual paved road 3 miles away, which I drive across every time I go out, which we all drive across every time we go out. This is in Nevada County, California, at the 3,000-foot level on the western side of the Sierra Nevada, in the middle of what everybody knows as gold rush country. So you're looking at a 2.5 mile wide plain of white gravel at the 3,000-foot level. And it's beginning to come back with some ponderosa pine and some manzanita. And the forestry guy says, well, give it 5,000 years and you'll never notice it. And that's the way the world actually is. And it will be, whether we're still here or not. So take some comfort in that, if you can. Having said those things, I want to state my own values in part in regard to the U.S. Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the BLM. And, by extension, you can draw some conclusions about what I might think about private land. But let's just talk about public land for a minute. The first thing about public land is that it's public land. It's public land. And the Forest Service and BLM guys sometimes forget that. Even, in their news releases to the press, like in southern Nevada, southeastern Nevada, a couple of months ago, when, what was his name, Cliven Bundy, the rancher held off the BLM from coming in to get their grazing fee payments. And they told the press, this is federal land. It's not federal land, it's public land, which makes it much more interesting. And also, of course, is the issue that the Nevada sagebrush, what was it, crazies, were coming up with in regard to, Nevada is what, 80% public land? They have to think about that, I'm afraid. But who would want to take care of 80% of the land as a private landowner, especially when it doesn't have any water? You might as well have it managed by your public agency, which is not well paid anyway. And how do we know that it is public land? Well, the way we know, like with the Forest Service and with the grazing leases, is that we as the public are called on to attend hearings. And we have the right to write in and give our opinions, and we have the right to come up with alternative plans. If it were a private corporation, you'd have none of that opportunity, except as maybe a major shareholder. Now it's true, and this is the downside of it, that you can go to hearings and you can write in your opinions, and maybe they won't even read them. But at least you have the chance to try. And in recent years, the politics of it have gotten much juicier, so that, like in the area where I live, where besides all the other things in the world that I'm interested in, I've also been much involved with timber management issues in the Tahoe National Forest. And once in a while, we actually get through to them, and there is the possibility of some real thought and change taking place. And that will only continue to happen the more that people take on and enjoy their responsibility or their opportunity to get in and do those kinds of things. Now, next I'm going to offer a little footnote. This is just my personal opinion. I happen to be a Buddhist, and one of my major activities, I don't spend a lot of time on it, but it's a major activity, is meditation. And what is it about meditation that is really interesting and powerful? It is that it is very boring. Even Chogyam Trungpa said that. And he was a pretty interesting guy. But he said, talking to his Tibetan students over in Boulder, his students of Tibetan Buddhism, he said, you'll learn how to be bored if you sit and meditate. It's good for you. And so, we figured that out, that, yeah, that's not so bad for you. And then, here's my addition to it. Chogyam Trungpa never said this. Then you should go to meetings. Because by comparison to meditation, meetings will seem really interesting. And this is the beginning of the new democracy. Well, sometimes it works. So a few things about parks, national parks. My own position in regard to these things is I'm somewhere in the middle between the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park System. I find the Forest Service more challenging, more interesting, and more frustrating than the Park Service. The Park Service doesn't have a whole lot to do except to decide whether or not they should put a fire out. And then who should they give a contract to come in and manage the tourism. And they have to try to make themselves attractive to a certain percentage of tourists because a lot of their income comes from that. But they don't really have to wrestle with the management questions. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are at this point, otherwise very good people, but making their main issue sound like they're talking about national parks, is when they say we want pristine wild and completely untrammeled freedom for large mammals and so forth. It's true. Large mammals really do, such as the grizzly bear, as the prime example. The grizzly bear does not do well with a whole lot of human competition or involvement. It would rather have a lot of space, and it would rather not be bothered. It does not go around looking for human beings to chew on. Human beings don't smell good, and they don't taste very good, probably. Not knowing for sure myself. But that's one of the arguments for large national parks or large wilderness areas. Is that the larger mammals, certain large mammals and certain animals require that. Like the wolverine does not do well in close to human beings. There are other animals that do just great, like deer and coyote, who are, and that's a different challenge entirely. Human beings are challenged to adapt to coyotes in the city and adapt to deer in their garden. That's the adaptation that's called for right there. I was talking yesterday to Kevin Van Allen, whom John mentioned earlier, whose bailiwick is Chicago, Human Beings in Nature. And he was telling me, I asked him, I said, well, how many coyotes are there now, do you think, in the Chicago urban area? He said, oh, a couple thousand. Have you ever heard about that? Well, they don't want to tell you too much about it, but they're doing really well. And they are doing a lot in keeping the number of rabbits in the golf courses and the number of rats down, and who knows what else. Because there's a couple of, the coyotes are making the adaptation. The human beings are just barely following along behind them in the adaptation. The adaptation is, for one thing, the coyotes stay out of sight during the day, and they turn up at night. And this is what Kevin told me, which is the best story I've heard in weeks, that the video monitors on some of the stoplight systems in the city that keep track of violators that go through red lights have shown coyotes standing waiting for a green light. Really? And they just figure that they know that it's safer that way. So, you know, and then it is a real challenge to tolerate and find a way to live with deer in your garden. The way I solved that, I don't live in the city, I live way out in the woods, but I had to put up a very high fence around my garden, and that works. So, you know, swallowing the trouble and the expense of it once it's in, at least that's off your mind. So I value biodiversity, the variety and the full variety of wild beings, wild creatures, and also wild vegetation in an area. And my greatest fear for years, my greatest environmental fear for years, has been in the area of the loss of biodiversity on all scales. Some scales you can't sell the public. You know, you're not going to get too many people excited about the Sacramento Delta smelt, which is a little fish about this big. Yet it is a big issue right now that ties up water politics in the state of California and the question of how more water is going to be shipped down to the farmers and growers in the southern part of the Great Central Valley, and then over the mountain range and into Los Angeles City, where a lot of Northern California water has been going for a long time. But the smelt is not a charismatic creature. And there are other non-charismatic creatures which people say, look at you blankly and say, what? In fact, even spotted owls. How many people have seen a spotted owl? A few. That's because you're up here in Gunnison. And also some of you folks I know, I've been working in the Forest Service and in some of the other agencies. I've seen a spotted owl one time. And I live in the middle of a deep forest. And I've seen it in the daytime sitting on a limb, motionless. Otherwise, I've been out with people who have told me what I heard when I heard it was the barking sound of a spotted owl. Well, the whole timber industry of the Northwest was way slowed down on account of the spotted owl. And the environmental community, I would say, has never been very good at explaining why that is important or how it is important. And then they don't know what to say when it comes to the question of, well, why the Delta smelt? The world's leading fisheries expert who teaches at UC Davis testified on television about the Delta smelt about 8 or 9 years ago, and was finally asked by his interrogator, and he's a very sweet man too, by the interrogator, well, why is the Delta smelt valuable? And he said, oh, well, it's a neat little fish. That doesn't cut it. So at one point in the national parks and wilderness debates and conversations that were going on, I was reached by a newspaper journalist from the New York Times on the telephone who was writing an article on this. And he said, well, we know about your history and you're sort of well-known in these concerns, and we thought we would ask you about this because it's come up. It wouldn't come up anymore, but it was 10 or 15 years ago. He said, people want to take their cell phones when they go on wilderness trips and be able to make cell phone calls from wherever they are. And don't you feel that that is against the spirit of serenity and tranquility and purity that the wilderness is, that people go to the wilderness for? I said, heck no. I'm only interested in the wilderness as habitat for big animals. I don't care who uses a cell phone there. That's up to them. And I also said I signed off a long time. I used to be a Snow Peak mountaineer. I signed off a long time ago on helicopter search and rescue on mountaineering accidents. I said, if I have a mountaineering accident, that's my business. I don't want anybody coming looking for me. So that's, you know, I'm an old style person. And that is an old style attitude, I confess. But I do feel that, you know, those are trivial questions compared to what the real value of large-scale wilderness and even small-scale wildernesses are in the contemporary world. And we just have to pay for it, in a sense. We have to account for it as part of the taxes we pay to a wild planet, which is, of course, still wild. And then if you want to talk about the size of the wild, this is a wild universe we live in. It goes for a long ways. And we don't even know anything about it yet. So coming down to California and working wild landscapes, which is another current debate, the idea of the working landscape as an alternative to protected wild. And I don't know why that's such an issue right now, because the working landscape already exists in the form of what they call multiple use in the U.S. Forest Service. and also as a matter of ordinary range practice, grazing practice, and rules and regulations in the Bureau of Land Management. Maybe on private land, people can call a landscape a working landscape and get away with something. But what happens on, what you hope for in working range land is, and it should continue to be the case, that you don't use pesticides, fertilizers, introduced plants, unless there's some really good reasons, keeping it as close as possible to the pre-contact condition, cut down or keep down the numbers of roads and fences, use drift fences when needed, no irrigated pasture, no big sprinkler systems, run your cattle. And fence away the riparian areas, keep the cattle away from some of the streams, and have designated watering spots for them. And they've been doing that for a long time anyway. And in the timber, the logging territory, especially on the west side of the West Coast, western Washington, western Oregon, western Northern California, which is where the timber really is. The somewhat contentious issue there is mixed age plantings and mixed species replantings as against plantation plantings. Monospecies, one age plantations of ponderosa pine or primarily ponderosa pine, in some cases Douglas fir. That was very strong 30 or 40 years ago, the force toward that with Sierra Pacific Industries and some of the national forests. And it has been questioned so much that it is kind of fading away. So that the real issue now is, as you all know here, wildfires. And the Forest Service has to certainly take some blame for having practiced fire suppression for the last 100 years when they should have been more selective and let some fires burn. This is particularly true in the Sierra Nevada, but it's also true in parts of the Southwest and parts of the Rockies, where we have had some really devastating fires and are still having devastating fires, like the Happy Camp Fire in the Klamath River Basin that is still going on right at this moment. I live in a high-risk fire zone myself, and I hesitate to go on trips this time of year even, because I have my own firefighting tools, my water system, and I know that you can't count on the tanker planes and the bulldozers to be at your place just when the fire comes to your place. Ultimately, you're going to have to take your own stand, make your own decision about whether to pull out or not, and make your decision about whether or not you're going to defend your place. Over the last 40 years, what I've been doing with the help of friends is reducing the fuel ladder, the fuel from the underbrush that goes up into the canopy, to at least reduce the opportunity for the flames on the ground to get up into the canopy. And my pine trees are all 70, 80, 100, 110 feet high. But in a big wind, you can't do nothing. You might as well just pack up and go if it's a really big wind, and we all know that. So that's what, I talk of these things with a certain amount of reality behind me and my own realization of what I'm looking at too, as well as all the other people in the what they call the wildland interface of California. The part of it that really needs correction is the real estate and county supervisor people like down in Southern California who okay new developments and have been doing it right up until just last year in areas which are in the wildland interface and in which, and chaparral, really not forest, and in which people's houses are going to burn. And they still allow that to be done and somehow manage not to have to take the blame for it too much. So I live, as I've said, in Northern California. we are, as the media have all said, in a drought. The drought, this is a favorite word of English department intellectuals. The drought is a social construct. If this was 1880, and it was as dry as it is this year, and the snowpack was as low as it was last summer, there wasn't enough population either in the cities or in the agricultural ranges of the Great Central Valley to consider it a disaster. There would have been adequate water for the whole season for everybody to get through, and they would have said, oh yeah, this is a dry year. But it wouldn't have been a disaster, and they wouldn't use the vocabulary drought. And so you have to remember that just as part of the picture, that it's the human impact that causes this vocabulary, and if the human impact is maybe out of proportion, that needs to be thought about too. I mean, I would think for California, the proportion is such that it would be better off if no more people came there. And so I shall tell you all, it's full of poison oak and rattlesnakes. It's really too dry, and it's got a lot of awful hippies. And so you don't want to go there. And besides, real estate is cheaper in the Midwest, or it used to be anyway. I don't know now. Well, thank you for hearing that rant. And I'm going to continue my exploration or disclosure here of the sense I have had over the years of the whole idea of watersheds and what's important about it, with reading a few poems from my collection called Mountains and Rivers Without End, which has been actually the major work of my last 50 years, while writing other things as well. And the key here, the key term for a lot of what I've been doing here with this and related ideas is bioregionalism. A larger scale, a sense of how we should look at landscapes, and removing ourselves back a few steps from critical judgment about what is overdeveloped and underdeveloped or anything like that, basing it on watershed consciousness for one thing. Watersheds are often overlooked. They are pristine, they are natural nations of their own. And the boundaries between watersheds are not arguable. This is so different from the political jurisdictions that were established in the 19th century in the West by people sitting in little cities somewhere, drawing lines on the map with rulers and saying, this will be Colorado. This will be the line between Nevada and California. So arbitrary, so unrelated to the reality on the ground or the reality of the rivers. The person that we must honor who stood against that as much as he could was John Wesley Powell, who was a visionary and eccentric and wonderful scholar of and explorer of the West, and who was finally fired from his job as the head of the Smithsonian Institute by a coalition of Congress people in the Western states, because he argued, not only said obviously and openly, the thing you guys can't forget is the West is an arid place. And then the next thing he said was, and we should try to divide it up according to its rivers and watersheds instead of cutting it arbitrarily this way and that way. That got him in trouble. So remembering John Wesley Powell, is to our advantage, and to look at some of his writings is a great help. We're trying to go back to, some of us are trying to go back to reawakening that way of looking at the landscape, and also appreciating the fact that a river, any river or stream, any complex of streams, complex of tributaries and substreams, sub-watersheds, sub-sub-watersheds, they're really all one place. The Sacramento River is one whole system of its own. The Colorado is another whole system of its own. It's all one river. It's all flowing at one moment as it makes its way down. And it's in the nature of the water cycle, the planetary water cycle, and it's in the nature of nature itself and the nature of water itself. However polluted it is, it gets purified. Whatever poisons are there will be gone. It may take a long time, but the planet is capable of its own healing extraordinarily in the long range, and sometimes even in the short range. As they have found in recent studies, the little mammals that run around in Russia, where they had the terrible atomic energy center accident. What was it called? Chernobyl, right. Senior moment. The little mammals in Chernobyl, some American and other European and Russian investigators have been put on special suits and gone in there to look at what's going on. They found that the animals have high radiation levels and they're doing fine. They have made an adaptation to higher radiation in just 3 or 4 generations. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing, but it's a good thing, that they have been able to do this. And it bides well for, whatever awful things are yet to come, that our living matter that we all share has a great deal of more resistance and ability to renew itself than we have imagined. Mountains and rivers without end. The term mountains and rivers means in Chinese and Japanese is a compound that means landscapes. That has always been the term simply for landscapes, mountains and rivers. In those languages and in those writings. Mountains and Rivers Without End is the title of a class of landscape paintings that share that title, paintings that run from probably around the 10th century right up till modern times, the last 1,000 years. And they are not vertical hanging scrolls, they are scrolls that unfold horizontally and have to be viewed on a table. And you never would, you would never ordinarily unroll a whole such scroll. You'd do 4 or 5 feet at a time, roll it in and roll it out, and view more of it. I became aware of that particular type of Chinese painting at some point in my early 20s. And then I was working on forest fire lookouts for the Mount Baker National Forest some seasons up just south of the Canadian border in the Skagit River drainage of the Mount Baker National Forest, and began to reflect on what is involved in trying to artistically reproduce, reflect, on large natural sceneries, large natural scenes, and large expanses of land, just as part of my thinking. And that was before the North Cascades National Park was in existence. It was still a national forest then. Over 40 years then, I wrote this little sequence of poems, not so little, it's 38 poems, but I'm only going to read a few to you now. And starting with this, Old Bones. Out there, walking around, looking out for food, a rootstock, a bird call, a seed that you can crack, plucking, digging, storing, snagging, barely getting by. No food out there on the dusty slopes of scree. Carry some, look for some, go for a hungry dream. Deer bone, Dal's sheep, bones hunger home. Out there somewhere, a shrine for the old ones, the dust of the old bones, old songs and tales. What we ate, who ate what, how we all prevailed. That poem came to me yesterday afternoon, came back to me, I remembered it. Standing up on the mountain and looking at these little scrapings out of what were possibly 10,000-year-old living sites where bones and points had been found. There is apparently a faint record of a decamillennium, 10,000 years, of people living up on top of that hill over various winters. I thought of this, which is actually based on some archaeological stuff in the Arctic. Oh, I was going to open with Dogen, you know. This is really the opening of all of this. The 12th century Japanese philosopher Dogen said, in a talk he gave, an ancient Buddha said, a painted rice cake does not satisfy hunger. That's an old Chinese saying, actually. A painted rice cake is a kind of candy that you have with tea. It does not satisfy hunger. Dogen then comments, there are really very few who have ever seen this painting of a rice cake, and none of them have thoroughly understood it. The paints for painting rice cakes are the same as those used for painting mountains and rivers. If you say the painting is not real, then the material, phenomenal world is not real. The Dharma is not real. Unsurpassed enlightenment is a painting. The entire phenomenal universe and the empty sky are nothing but paintings. Since this is so, there's no remedy for satisfying hunger other than a painted rice cake. Without painted hunger, you can never become a real person. No, you don't want to say that. Nobody knows what that means. The Kenyan wren. I look up at the cliffs, but we're swept on downriver. The rafts wobble and slide over royals of water. Boulders shimmer under the arching streams. Rock walls straight up on both sides. A hawk cuts across that narrow sky, hit by sun. We paddle forward, backstroke, turn, spinning through eddies and waves, stair steps of churning whitewater above the roar. Hear the song of a canyon wren. A smooth stretch, drifting and resting. Hear it again, delicate downward song, dee-dee, 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 dee, descending through ancient beds. A single female mallard flies upstream, shooting the 100-pace rapids. Sudong Po, in the 12th century, saw for a moment it all stand still. He wrote, I stare at the water. It moves with unspeakable slowness. Dogen, writing at midnight, mountains flow. Water is the palace of the dragon. It doesn't flow away. We beach up at China Camp between piles of stones stacked there by black-haired miners. Cook in the dark, sleep all night long by the stream. These songs that are here and gone, here and gone, to purify our ears. This is from another time and place, much older, in eastern Czechoslovakia, in what was once a Upper Paleolithic community of mammoth hunters, which we know because the mammoth bones are still there. There's a wonderful archaeological work underway there still today, just on the border of Slovakia. This is called Under the Hills near the Morava River. She lay there midst mammoth, reindeer, and wolf bones, a diadem of fox teeth over her brow. Teeth, I gotta do this better. A diadem of fox teeth round her brow, ochre under her hips. 26,640 plus or minus 110 years ago. Burnt reindeer pelvis bone bits in her mouth. The bones of two men by them lying there, one on each side. The triple Czech burial, as it's known, near the Morava River. Nobody knows what it is or why. Another short one, The Bear Mother. A tiny poem which reflects back on the whole story, the long story about which, concerning which I wrote 3 or 4 long poems, and also a complete version of one of the stories of the woman who married a bear, a North American Indian story of a great distribution, actually, which has parallels in very early ancient Greek mythology. The Bear Mother. This came to me in a dream while flying in a small plane over the Brooks Range. She veils herself to speak of eating salmon, teases me with, "What do you know of my ways?" and kisses me through the mountains, through and under its rocky layers, its gullies, its folds, her mouth full of blueberries we share. Ravensbeek River at the end. The Ravensbeek River is known, oddly enough in English, as the Tatshenshini. It comes out of the Yukon, goes across part of southeast Alaska, and then enters a very poorly named place called Dry Bay, where it rains all the time. Tatshenshini actually is an Indian word, which means shitty beak. And shitty beak means raven. So that's how I pulled all that together. The Doab. Now here's a good river word for you. If you don't know it, remember it. A Doab, which you will find in the English language dictionary, is a word from the Urdu that was brought back by the British, which is the piece of land, usually sort of pointed and D-shaped, between 2 major rivers when they come together. The Doab of, in this case, the Doab of the Tatshenshini River and Alsek Lake, a long spit of gravel. One clear day after days on the river in the rain, the glowing sandy slopes of castellea blooms and little fox tracks in the moose print swales, giant scoops of dirt took out by grizzly bears around the lupin roots. At early light, a rim of snowy mountains and the ice fields slanting back for miles, I find my way to the boulders on the gravel in the flowers at the end of the glacier. Two ravens sitting on a boulder, carried by the glacier, left on the gravels, resting in the flowers. At the end of the Ice Age, show me the way to a place to sit in a hollow in a boulder, and looking east, looking south, ear in the river, running just behind me, nose in the gravel, vetch roots scooped up by the bears in the gravels, looking up the ice slopes, ice plains, rockfall, brush line, dirt sweeps. The ancient river, blue queen, floating in from the ice lake, her ice throne, the end of a glacier, looking north up the dancing river where it turns into a glacier. Under stair steps of ice falls, green streaks of alder climb the mountain knuckles, interlaced with snowfields. Foamy water falling, salmon weaving river, bear flower, blue fox singer, as the raven leaves her boulder, flying over flowers. Raven sitting high spot, eyes on the snow peaks, nose of morning, raindrops in the sunshine, skin of sunlight, skin of chilly gravel, mind in the mountains, mind of tumbling water, mind running rivers, mind of sifting flowers in the gravels. At the end of the Ice Age, we are the bears, we are the ravens, we are the salmon at the end of an Ice Age. We wash our bowls in this water. Quote, the 1.5 billion cubic kilometers of water on the entire Earth are split by photosynthesis and reconstituted by respiration once every 2 million years. Hydrology, I don't know if that's true or not. But the planetary water cycle, man, that is really something. And, you know, when you get one of these 8 or 10 inches of sudden unexpected rainfall, that's what it is. It's the planetary water cycle visiting you. A day on the ragged North Pacific coast getting soaked by whipping mist, rain squalls tumbling, mountain mirror ponds, snowfield slush, rock-wash creeks, earfuls of falls, swirls of ridge-edge snowflakes, swift gravelly rivers, tidewater crumbly glaciers, high-hanging glaciers, shoreside mud pools, icebergs, streams looping through the tide flats, spume of brine, distant soft rain drooping from a cloud, sea lions lazing under the surface of the sea. We wash our bowls in this water. It has the flavor of ambrosial dew. Gashi simpaswe nyo ten kanro meat, Zen monks say at lunch. Beaching the raft, stagger out and shake off wetness like a bear, stand on the sandbar, rest from the river, being upwellings, side swirls, back swirls, curl-overs, out-ripples, eddies, chops and swells, washovers, shallows, confluence turbulence, wash-seam wavelets, riffles, saying, a hydraulic is a cross between a wave and a hole. You get a weir effect. A pillow rock is a total fold back over a hole. It shows spit on the top of the wave. A haystack's a series of waves at the bottom of a tight channel. There's a tongue of the rapids, the slick tongue, the V. Some holes are keepers, they won't let you through. Eddies, backflows, we say eddies are your friends. Current differential, it can suck you down. Vertical boils are straight up eddies spinning. Herringbone waves curl under and come back. Well, let's get going. Get back to the rafts. Swing the big oars. Head into a storm. We offer it to all demons and spirits. May all be filled and satisfied. Om Makala Sai Swaha. Sayok Jin Shu Shitsu Ryo Toka Ho Man Om Makara Sai Sowaka. Sudung Po, the great poet, sat out one night, all night, by the creek on the slopes of Mount Lu. Next morning, he showed this poem to his teacher. The stream with its sounds is a long, broad tongue. The looming mountain is a wide-awake body. Throughout the night, song after song. How can I speak at dawn? Old Master Zhangzang approved him. He became a final Zen teacher at that point. 2 centuries later, in a talk in Japan, Dogen said, the sounds of streams and the shapes of mountains. The sounds never stop, the shapes never cease. Was it Su the poet who woke up, or was it the mountains and rivers? Billions of beings see the morning star. They all become Buddhas. If you, who are valley, streams, and looming mountains, can't throw some light on the nature of ridges and rivers, who the hell can? He was talking to his monks. Fortunately, not to us. Well, this is going to be the last poem I'm going to read from this collection tonight. It's called Earth Verse, and it came to me in the central deserts of Western Australia when Nausakaki, the Japanese poet, and I were out there for a month in 1981. Believe it or not, invited by an Aboriginal tribal leader to an area that you cannot go to, or you couldn't at that time, without a special invitation. And we weren't even Australians. Nanao came down from Japan, I came from the West Coast. Earth Verse. Wide enough to keep you looking, open enough to keep you moving, dry enough to keep you honest, prickly enough to make you tough, green enough to go on living, old enough to give you dreams. Earth Verse! Exclamation point. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so two great poets, Aaron Abeyta and Gary Snyder, will be signing books in the hallway. For those of you who are here for the entire Headwaters Conference, we're going to begin registration and free breakfast at 7:15 in the University Center tomorrow morning. Make sure you're there on time at 7:45. The author Sean Prentice will read a piece from his new book on Finding Abbey, about Edward Abbey, another Western alum, done well. And if you need to register now, Donna is in the hallway. Let's also thank Donna Holden and Rachel Estrada for making all the behind-the-scenes work happen, please. There's also a mailing list going around. If you want to be part of the next 25 years, put your name and email. I promise less than 4 emails a year. All right, so book signings out in the lobby, and thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Gary Snyder, one more time.